Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. On today's Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Dr. Evelyn Forget. Dr. Forget is a professor of economics and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Her research examines the health and social implications of poverty and inequality, and she is often called upon by governments, First Nations, and international organizations to advise on poverty, inequality, health, and social outcomes. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an Officer of the Order of Canada. Her most recent books are Basic Income for Canadians from the COVID-19 Emergency to Financial Security for All and Radical Trust, Basic Income for Difficult Lives. In today's episode, Dr. Forget describes basic income and explains how it differs from UBI, or Universal Basic Income. She talks about the results of pilot studies done here in Canada about basic income and answers the question, if basic income is such a great idea, why haven't we done it already? And finally, Dr. Forget describes what a Canadian basic income program would look like. I bring you my conversation with Dr. Evelyn Forget. Dr. Evelyn Forget, thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
I'm delighted to be here.
I want to talk to you about a subject that is increasingly in the news and in the public discourse in the last couple of years. And I wanted to speak with you specifically because you're one of Canada's leading experts on what's called UBI, or Universal Basic Income. And in fact, you literally wrote the book on it, Basic Income for Canadians. And for those of our listeners who might not be familiar, can you tell us what Universal Basic Income, or UBI, is?
Well, basic income at its heart is really just an attempt to make sure that everybody has access to enough money to meet their basic needs every month. In Canada, that's taken a very particular form. We tend to talk about a guaranteed income. That is, we think that this money should be available whether you're working or whether you're not working. It should be targeted to people at most need, and it should be available to everybody of working age in Canada.
Okay, and so having everybody have their basic needs met, I think, is a noble goal that few people can argue against in good faith. And let's give humanity the benefit of the doubt and say that most people, including those in the halls of power, have felt that way both in contemporary society and throughout our species history. And yet, a society where everybody has had their basic needs met is vanishingly rare. So what makes you think that basic income would succeed where so many other efforts that we have tried over the course of thousands, tens of thousands of years has failed?
I think most of the programs that we have in place to deliver support to people, to deliver income to people, tend to be based on concepts of deservingness, right? People need to deserve the money. They need to demonstrate that they're behaving in particular ways that we approve of, that they spend the money on the things they ought to be spending the money on, that they're trying hard to work to get a job. There's an element of distrust in almost all of the programs that we have in place. And I think one of the differences with basic income is that we can back up a little bit on all of the bureaucracy that's put in place to police people and to ensure that they're behaving in ways that we think they ought to behave. And we can recognize that most people know a lot about what their basic needs are and what the needs of their family are. And if given the money, they tend to spend that money in ways that make their lives better. They have the freedom to allocate the money where they want to spend it. They can spend it on better housing. They can spend it on better food. They can choose to go to school. They can invest in job training. We don't need special programs, all of which are designed to I think make the donor, make the payer happy about spending the money to ensure that the taxpayers' money is going where it ought to go.
So let me tell you my thoughts on every time I read about basic income and I read the arguments from
Yep.
proponents. They make a lot of sense to me and they resonate, and I think, yeah, that seems like a really good idea. I mean, there's bad arguments in favor of it, but I'm talking about the good ones, and those they make sense, and I walk away convinced. And then I look at some of the arguments against basic income and why it would not achieve the noble goals that it's supposed to. And again, there's a lot of bad arguments against basic income, but some of them are. But I tend to walk away from the good ones, thinking, oh yeah, maybe we should hold back a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. But before we get into those specific arguments, is it necessary? I went on to Statistics Canada, and in 2015, the poverty rate in Canada was 14.5%, which surprised me. That seemed very high for like 8 years ago. And then in 2020, so I'm guessing this happened just before the COVID outbreak, the poverty rate was down to 8.1%. So that's down about 40% or so in just 5 years. Not quite in half a decade. So aren't we, like, that's a very positive trend. I think that's great. So aren't we on the right track with our existing programs? And can't if we enhance what we have been doing, uh, we're definitely headed in the right direction in that sense. Can't we get there without basic income?
I think that I think that there are two answers to that question. I think that, first of all, we've definitely changed the way we measure poverty. So I think part of what you're seeing is a difference in definition. But the other part of it is that there were an awful lot of programs put in place during the pandemic to support people. And so we see in the data the benefits of those programs. We see the reduction in poverty rates that were associated with the payouts during the pandemic. But you ask whether the programs we have in place can't address the poverty that we see. After all, every province has some form of income or social assistance that's available to working age people. We have the Canada Child Benefit. Seniors have access to OAS and GIS. And if you look at all of these programs, there are actually hundreds and hundreds of programs available across the country. Some of them are offered by the federal government. Some of them are offered by provincial governments. Some of them are offered by municipal governments. And they're all embedded within a framework of nonprofit organizations that provide services and goods to people who are trying to fill gaps. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of programs. We're spending a lot of money attempting to address poverty. Some of those programs provide services. Some of them provide cash. Some of them provide really complicated mixtures of the two. And I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the place of somebody who needs a little bit of help, because
Mm-hmm.
people only apply for assistance if they need help. So suppose you're a 42-year-old woman, you might be non-status, living in New Brunswick, you've got a son who's got asthma, you need medication, and you're facing eviction. And oh, by the way, you maybe have a little home business. You sell candles on the side, make a few dollars every month. Where do you get help, right? You're going to lose your housing, you need money. Where do you go? Hundreds of programs available out there. What's available to you? We ask people, every one of those programs has different application procedures, different regulations that govern it, different eligibility rules. So we ask people at the very, very worst times in their lives, when they're facing horrible circumstances, to find their way to a computer, to a desktop, and to sit down and to navigate the websites of all of these different programs to find out if A, they qualify, and B, to set up an account and figure out how to apply for it. There are incredible gaps in these programs, which is why we still have poverty rates, even though we're spending all of this money addressing poverty, even though all of these programs are in place. There are gaps that people fall between. There are overlaps, there are inefficiencies, and every one of these programs has their own bureaucracy with their own set of rules and regulations and their own goals at the end of it. Now, I want to give a shout out. There's an organization called Prosper Canada that's created something called the Benefits Navigator. And you can find it just by Googling Prosper Canada Benefits Navigator. And it asks you some basic information about yourself. So you can type in, basic demographics, how old you are, what sex you are, what province you live in, and so on. and it'll give you a list of programs you might be eligible for. Even with that navigator, it's incredibly difficult to find out what it is you might benefit from. And as a consequence, most people never get all of the money that they're entitled to receive from any level of government. So the benefits are out there. People don't necessarily receive them because of the complexity of the system. And so one of the things that basic income does, I think, is to consolidate some of those cash transfer programs. Now, the thing about basic income is that it's only money. It doesn't replace other social services. We still need healthcare. We still need addiction treatment programs. We still need adequate housing and supportive housing. We still need those kinds of things. But the cash transfer programs, things like the GST transfer, for example, things like provincial income assistance, provincial social assistance, ways of just giving money to people. If we were to accommodate, to put all of these together, to coordinate them, to have a single gateway to them, people would actually get the benefits to which they're entitled. They wouldn't be treated differently. You'd have a certain form of horizontal equity. People in the same circumstances would receive the same kinds of benefits. And we would be dealing with far less bureaucracy and far less complexity, both for the applicants and for the recipients.
So less bureaucracy, simpler programs, and
Mhm.
the elimination or consolidation of not the entirety of the
Yeah,
federal and provincial governments, but the cash transfer elements of the
parts of it.
so things like I guess the baby bonus or the GST credit we would just eliminate, and there would be replaced with
Yeah.
basic income. That's your
Right.
proposal?
And if you think about it, there are already two groups of Canadians who have access to forms of basic income. Children receive the Canada Child Benefit. That is a form of the basic income.
Hmm.
Seniors
But
who
that goes to the parents, right? Like
and that
the
goes to
parents
the
get some
parents,
money each month.
but they
Yeah,
get it for the children, right?
right.
And for seniors, people over 65, they have access to the OAS and either the CPP or the Guaranteed Income Supplement if their incomes are low enough. And if you look at the poverty rate for seniors, it's a fraction of what it is for working age adults. We've actually done a rather good job of dealing with poverty among seniors relative to other OECD countries and relative to the way seniors were treated in the past. Neither of those programs have solved the problem, but they've got a long, long, long way towards reducing, virtually eliminating deep poverty and reducing the rate of poverty for those particular groups. The real gap that exists in the Canadian context is for working age adults, people between the ages of 18 and 64, who have to rely on this incredible mishmash of programs. Things like employment insurance, which covers an increasingly small portion of the people who are actually working. Things like provincial income assistance, which doesn't address the needs of the working poor. People on um, inadequate employment, insecure employment. So these are the kinds of things that a basic income can address by consolidating some of those programs and making them more readily available.
Okay, so let's talk about numbers, because I think most conversations about income, basic income, UBI come down to that. I did some rough calculations, and if we go with universal basic income, that is, everybody's entitled to a certain amount of money with no
Nobody,
conditions.
I need to say, I mean, you've talked about universal basic income a couple of times, but nobody actually in Canada is making that kind of an argument. We're talking about a guaranteed income, right? So
So
it's targeted towards low income people.
okay, yeah, I was going to get to that. That like actually giving everybody in Canada a certain lump sum of money per year would be
Yeah.
incredibly expensive, and in fact, that's why your book is called Basic Income for Canadians, not Universal Basic Income. So yeah, I'll acknowledge that you did not that wasn't your thing, but I hear again in the public conversation, I hear mostly about UBI far more than I hear like universal basic income, far more than I hear about a guaranteed income or just basic income. But to use the 2020 poverty rate of 8.1%. That's the latest that I got from Stats Canada. Canada has a population of about of 40 million, so that's about 3.25 million people living in poverty. If we say we give these people just $1,000 a month, okay, which is not a lot. That's the $12K a year is a fair amount. The cost of that would be approximately $39 billion. The deficit in the 2023 budget is forecast to be $40 billion. So that would essentially double the deficit, and $40 billion outside of the 2020 to 2022, where the deficit exploded because of COVID. 40 billion is still pretty high over the course of the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
So the cost of there's a little bit more subtlety in your book than the example that I'm giving. But if we give everyone living at or below the poverty line $1,000 a month, we're talking with just under $40 billion. We're talking about doubling the national deficit. That's no small investment. So, so if we're talking about a substantial sum of money, there needs to be a substantial justification for that expenditure.
Well, there does indeed, but we also need to look at the numbers a little bit more subtly. First of all,
please.
We're talking only about working age adults, so we're talking only about people between 18 and 64. We're not talking about children who receive the Canada Child Benefit, and if they continue to receive the Canada Child Benefit, that's fine. That's part of the existing $40 billion deficit or existing government expenditure. Similarly, payments to seniors is part of the existing government expenditure. So we're not talking about that.
Okay, I was kind of assuming that that was wrapped in with the cash transfers, but
no, it need not be. It need not be. We can focus only on working age adults. We can actually give people a substantially higher basic income than $1,000 a month. So we're talking about 80% of the poverty line. We can set it on the basis of census families, so that adult children living with their parents are part of the same family. So you're not necessarily spending a lot of money on children who might have low incomes themselves, but be living in relatively comfortable circumstances. And you can do it at a relatively lower price. If you do that, you no longer have to pay for provincial income assistance, so that money gets saved. You no longer have to put in place a GST credit, so that money gets saved. And so the cost is the upfront cost is considerably less than the one you were just talking about a minute ago. But there's a second way of looking at investing in basic income, and that is treating it as an investment in the population you're dealing with. My background is in health economics, and my first foray into basic income was actually a reexamination of an old experiment that took place in the 1970s called Mincome. And in Mincome, there were a couple of sites in Manitoba where people received a guaranteed income. Winnipeg was one of them. The other one was a little town called Dauphin, Manitoba. And as a health economist, I was looking at a very basic question, and that is, a lot of what we treat in our hospitals and a lot of what we treat in our healthcare system is poverty, the consequences of poverty. People are there because they've, spent long lives with inadequate diets, working hard jobs, living in poor housing, and so on. And so the question is, if you can give people enough money to meet those basic needs, are there savings elsewhere? And what I found was a reduction in hospitalization rates of 8.5% for people who received a basic income over a 3-year period, relative to a control group. So relative to a group of people who were very similar, the same age, the same kinds of income, living in the same kind of a place, an 8.5% reduction of hospitalization.
That's huge. So like what you were describing, again, made sense to me in the sense that a lifetime of poor, inadequate shelter, particularly in Manitoba in winter with little insulation, poor diet, and these are things that you can get through a year or two maybe, but it accumulates over a year. You said that over the course of 3 years, that there was a dramatic drop in hospitalizations over a pretty short period of time.
Because we're actually treating crisis in the healthcare system. Social admissions are a very real part of what it is we do. People end up in the hospital because there's nowhere else for them to be. And that was especially true in the 1970s. We do have shelters. We do have certain supports that exist now that didn't exist in the 1970s. But But yeah, just ensuring that people have access to enough food. It really did make a difference, an 8.5% reduction, and that's massive if you think about the amount of money that Canada spends on healthcare, on health, hospitalization, and then you start multiplying that by all of the other social programs where we're treating the consequences of poverty. How many kids um, are receiving services in the education system, receiving special education, falling behind in their classes, and requiring extra support because their parents can't pay the rent and move too often from place to place. The kids move from school to school and they lose continuity in their education. And that requires extra costs in the education system. We see it in criminal justice, where people end up in prison, people end up in jail, because of the consequences of poverty. It's been estimated that 80% of incarcerated women are there for poverty-related crimes.
Like
You know,
Jean Valjean, who was sentenced to it like 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread.
maybe not stealing a loaf of bread, but things like passing bad checks and fraud, and those kinds of things. I mean, they're not. You know, these are these are costs we're already paying. There are incredible costs associated with poverty. So yeah, there are upfront costs for sure, but I think it's the investment in community that makes a real difference in the way we conceive of the basic income. So if you talk about the upfront costs, what you were saying just a minute ago, by my calculations, the upfront costs of the basic income are very similar to the upfront costs of other large programs that we do talk about and that we do finance. So things like the childcare expenditure, for example, $10 a day
Right.
childcare.
$10 a day across the country.
That's right. So,
Hmm.
if we can afford that, we can afford a basic income. So, I mean, that's the kind of expenditure we're talking about, something in that realm, and that will get people to 80% of the poverty line. And a lot of people sit back and say, well, why 80%? I mean, you're still leaving people in poverty. But the reality is that in most provinces, a working age adult, a single person receiving social assistance from the province is getting somewhere close to half the poverty rate. So they're getting something like $10,000 or $11,000 a year, and that's if they have housing. If they don't have housing, they get less, right? So I mean,
People without a home get less than if they do.
people without a home don't get the shelter allowance. That's right.
That seems almost
Unbelievable.
backwards. You would hope that people that don't have a home would get a little top up so that they have a roof over their heads.
Well, and that in fact is the point of a basic income. You give people the money without demonstrating that without having to demonstrate that they have rent receipts or showing up with other ways of proving what it is they're spending their money on. People can meet their needs. They can meet their needs in reasonable ways.
So that, in addition to simplifying the number of programs and finding it, it also cuts down on the oversight and the red tape required, both in terms of determining eligibility and maintenance and on an ongoing basis. It's simpler to administer and therefore cheaper.
That's right.
Okay, so it's happening again. That all sounds compelling. You mentioned this the Mincome experiment nearly 50 years ago in Manitoba. If the results are as you describe, and I have no reason to doubt you,
Yeah.
and it was so compelling at the time, why 50 years later it doesn't Manitoba, or for that matter anywhere else in Canada, have a basic income except for young children and seniors, and we don't call it basic income.
No, we certainly don't call it basic income. I think that there are two reasons. In a little way, history is repeating itself. In the 1970s, people went into the decade of the 1970s wanting to do something about poverty. There was sort of this rediscovery of poverty across North America. And there were 5 of these experiments that took place. But if you remember your economic history of the 1970s, a lot of things happened in the 1970s. There were a couple
Yeah,
of
in
oil.
terms of economics, probably the biggest one that I can think of is the OPEC oil embargo, which led to global inflation that took a long time to tame and had really quite devastating effects on many major
Absolutely.
economies.
And it puts current inflation, I must say, in the shade. So the inflation rate was heading towards 13%. I mean, the interest rates were heading close to 20%. Lots
Hmm.
of middle class people were losing their houses, and so government attention shifted away from poverty towards trying to manage this mess, this stagflation in the 1970s. So yeah, inflation, higher unemployment than anybody expected, and it just sort of fell off the agenda for a long time. So I think that that's what happened in the 1970s. But I think that there's something else sort of under the surface that we really have to deal with, and that is people's attitudes towards those who need a little bit of additional help. We're not a very generous society. We really aren't. We aren't prepared to believe that people who need help don't play a large role in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And there is this notion somehow that people have a responsibility to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, so to speak, to get themselves out of the difficulty they find themselves in. And it's very difficult to talk around that. I think those of us who live charmed lives, those of us who are in very comfortable circumstances, tend to forget that not everybody has gone through life with the same set of opportunities that we have, and it's very difficult, I think, for some people to actually count on the labor market to address issues of poverty. If you think about formerly incarcerated people, for example, getting a job and rehabilitating oneself, setting yourself up in life after you've been in prison, after you've been institutionalized, it's not an easy task. And finding a job that'll pay, that'll be adequate, is very, very difficult. The same thing happens. The same thing happens, I think, for people who've been institutionalized for any reason. If you think about kids aging out of the foster care system, we've had many censuses of the homeless population across Canada, and in every single case, we find that a large portion of people who are living in tents, people who are inadequately housed, were products of the child welfare system, of the foster care system. So it's very difficult for kids who are 18 years old who come out of the foster care system. I realize a lot of programs are now being extended to 21 or 25. But to come out of that system without the kind of parental support that our kids get, that so many kids get, and to establish yourself in life is a difficult one. And a lot of kids fall off the rails. And so people come out of circumstances that it's hard, I think, for many people to imagine. And it's hard not to blame people for the circumstances in which they find themselves. Well, just get a job, just get a better job, do some job training. And the notion that there are many barriers before you get to a point that you need to do some work on yourself before you can work in the labor market, I think is a hard one for people to wrap their heads around sometimes.
Yeah, I struggle sometimes with a decision that was made by my provincial government. I live in Ontario, and about 6 or 7 years ago, there was an announcement made that we were going to conduct our own pilot
Mm-hmm.
for basic income in Ontario. And I thought, that's great. As I mentioned before, I keep getting convinced by the people in favor of it, and then I keep getting convinced by the people against it. I'm a big proponent of evidence-based decision making. So finally, we're going to have some contemporary results in Ontario. So for me, that's the most relevant context, and I couldn't wait to see what the results were going to be. That was very exciting. And then we had an election, and one of the first things that the new government did was to cancel the pilot. And I was so infuriated because that's the destruction of knowledge. Like I didn't know what the results were going to be. And maybe it would have been Basic Income is a terrible idea. Maybe it would have been a panacea for so many of our social ills. And I wanted to know which way is it going to be? Most likely somewhere down the middle. But like, at least we'd know, what does it work for? What doesn't it work for? What are the pitfalls? What are the benefits? And it was canceled, so that we're lacking the knowledge. I mean, we've got the results, as you mentioned, from 50 years ago, but also there was a very particular economic context at the time, and a lot has changed in Canadian and world society in those 50 years. Do you know why? Can you provide a little bit more context about that experiment and if you have any insight into what the even possible motivation would be not to find out the truth about the effectiveness of such a program.
Yeah, I don't like to attribute motives to people, so I won't do that. But I will talk a
Okay,
little about that.
that's fine. I'm just struggling to understand.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, why is evidence a bad thing? I mean, it's an opportunity to gather data. You'd know whether it works or not.
Exactly.
Um, I agree. I actually was a little bit involved with that program, and I know many of the people who participated, many of the subjects of the experiment. And one of the things that became very clear anecdotally was that the first thing most people did was to improve their housing, and the second thing most people did was to register in community college. And I was actually quite shocked by, I mean, I actually found that in Dauphin many years ago. It wasn't college, it was high school. We found a little increase in the high school completion rate, but in this case, people were investing in job training. They wanted to get a better job. There was a survey done on the participants. People were being registered in that program, and some of the participants had been in the program for up to a year. The program was canceled, and so no official data was collected. There was a survey conducted by people at McMaster, and now it gets a little bit difficult because the people who participate in a survey are of course, self-selected, so you don't know how representative the data is. But the people who completed the survey, many of them reported improving their job conditions. So people left poor jobs, they got better jobs. People invested in job training. People were able to improve their housing circumstances. So the people who reported on the basic income found it a very, very positive experience. We did a little bit of self-rated health, self-rated mental health, self-rated physical. People claim to feel better. Whether that would translate into any change in the way they use the healthcare system, I don't know.
Yeah, we don't have data like we did in Manitoba for hospitalization rates.
No, and we didn't have that data in Manitoba. I mean, I only got that as a sort of a historical accident because, one of the bonuses of Medicare is it collects a lot of data about people. So I was able to find the participants in the Medicare data. But of course, we didn't have permission to do that in Ontario, and so we didn't get any data. And so there's no hard scientific data that came out of that. We have a lot of anecdotal data that it seemed to be improving people's lives, but that's sort of what you'd expect. If you give people a basic income, if people have enough money to meet their needs, they're going to be in a position to improve the quality of their life.
So these were tentative results and or at least preliminary ones, and based on bias might be too strong a word, but a non-representative sample size. But
Right.
but the few results that we do have, which need to be taken with a grain of salt, were
Yep.
quite positive. Is
Yep.
that a fair summary?
I think that's a fair summary. And there have been other experiments as well. One that's gotten a lot of attention recently is by Jiaying Zhao at the University of British Columbia, who's run a pilot on homeless people living in shelters. If
Okay.
you, if you give people a basic income, what happens? And the motivating question there was not are they going to work or not work, which was what was running the income experiment 50 years ago in the Ontario experiment. In her case, the motivating question is what are they going to spend the money on? Are we going to see an increase in expenditure on what she calls temptation goods?
Like
Alcohol,
cigarettes, alcohol, drugs.
drugs, and so on. And now again, this is an experiment, so you can only include in an experiment people who can consent to the satisfaction of an ethics board. So we excluded people with serious mental illness, or I won't say we
Mm-hmm.
excluded people who had serious mental illnesses and were unable to consent. But the people who were involved, relative to a control group, did not spend more money on temptation goods. So there was no increase in expenditure on negative things. People improved their housing situation, reported better health, better outcomes.
Okay, I've got a few other questions, but I want to ask a big one.
Okay.
And I've got a lot of specific questions, but just broadly speaking, if basic income is so good,
Yep.
and all indications from the data sets that we have is that it is incredibly effective, why doesn't it exist? Like, I'm not aware of any jurisdiction in the world, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any place that has basic income along the lines that you're describing. Why hasn't anybody gone beyond trials? And not just Canada, but even in the Scandinavian countries known as democratic socialist market economies, they don't have basic income along the lines that you're describing. So if it's so good, why do we have to be pioneers? That's not really what Canadians tend to do. I'm not against being the first, but it does make me skeptical that it's going to be as good as you say if nobody else is doing it.
Well, there are a lot of pilots underway. There are many in the U.S. Virtually every large city has several underway, so there are hundreds of little pilots taking place in the
That's great.
U.S.
I can't wait for the data, and maybe in 5 years we can have a data based conversation.
It's not entirely true. I mean, I said just a minute ago that two groups of Canadians already have access to what I would call a basic income, and that
Okay.
is parents. You're right, parents of kids under 18 and seniors. It's the 18 to 64-year-olds. It's the working age population. And I think the reason, and I mean, there all kinds of data has been collected in experiments all over the world about whether people stop working. That was the question that motivated the five experiments in the 1970s. If you give people money for nothing, will they stop working? And it turned out no, they don't. People who were working before the experiment pretty much continued working after the experiment. There wasn't a huge reduction in hours worked.
So people that were kept going back to school, whether college or high school, continued to work while doing so?
Well, no, there was one group of people in Dauphin. Uh, Now, here the language turns out to be really important.
Okay.
What was reported was young unattached males, that is, young single men, reduced their hours of work tremendously, and that was used as a negative. It was seen as a very negative outcome of the experiment. And so I looked at that. What do we mean by young unattached males? We're talking about 15 to 24-year-olds, 15 to
Mm-hmm.
19 in particular. And I found some of them, you know. Why did you stop working? Well, I stopped working because my family got a little bit more money and they decided I could stay in school just a bit longer. And what I heard over and over and over again was the boys in particular, not so much girls, but boys in particular, had been under a lot of pressure in these families, low income families in Dauphin, to become self supporting as quickly as they could. So they turned 16, they'd leave school when it was legal, and they'd get a job. They'd get a job in agriculture or manufacturing or someplace, and they'd go to work. When the parents had money available to them from income, they decided they could keep their kids in school just a bit longer. And so I actually met a lot of people who were the first in their families to graduate from high school.
Oh, wow. Well, I
Yeah,
mean, I'm a big proponent of education, so that I would consider that a positive result.
that was, well, exactly so. But I mean, it depends what you're measuring, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, one way of measuring that is that young unattached males reduce their hours of work dramatically. Well, the point is that young unattached males, 15 to 19-year-olds, weren't working that much to begin with. And the ones who quit their jobs, in fact, stayed in high school. And that's not a bad outcome. So the ones who went back to school, so to speak, continued to work. If you look at the overall data, we don't see a big reduction in the number of hours. We do see it for particular groups. In Dauphin, in particular, we saw it for those young unattached males. We also saw
Mm-hmm.
it for new mothers. And again, if you put yourself back into the 1970s before parental leaves, I think in the 1970s you were entitled to 4 weeks off if you gave birth. And a whole lot of mothers said, you know what, a 4 week maternity leave, I'm going to use some of the income money to buy myself a longer leave. And so they stayed home with new babies. Well, it turns out we know that's a good thing. That's why we have parental leaves. It's good for the family, it's good for society, it's good for everybody. So there are particular groups of people who work less for all kinds of reasons. I think you'd also find it among people at the end of a career. The numbers didn't show it in the Dauphin case, but if you think of somebody who's 55 or 60 years old and they lose their job, a basic income might make an earlier retirement a little bit possible. So you'd probably see a reduction in work effort among people at the end of their careers who maybe are being pushed out of the job that they're currently in. but you don't see a huge reduction. Nobody quits a job to live on $20,000 a year. It just isn't something that people strive to do. What it does do is that it allows people sometimes to move into better jobs, to undertake a bit of job training, to change things over time. We know from economics that sometimes people who are unemployed sometimes end up with better job market outcomes, are more likely to find jobs and to find good jobs than people who are currently employed. And part of the reason is that they can wait to find a job that actually matches their skills and abilities. And I think a basic income gives you just that little bit of freedom to do it.
So, one common argument I hear against basic income is that it fuels inflation.
Yeah,
And I can see it. And I have two questions about the connection between possible
yeah.
uh, uh, connection between basic income and inflation. And the simpler one is as follows: more government spending equals either more taxes or more or higher deficits. In either case, that leads to uh, crowding out private sector investment, which leads to higher inflation. And so we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of additional spending, and however you measure it, it's a major program initiative.
Mhm.
And given we're coming off of a very high inflation and that we're just sort of teetering on the brink at the moment of whether that's going to spike again or go down or stay level at a higher than acceptable level, uh, why wouldn't or like, are you willing to accept higher inflation? Is the connection that I've made not a valid one, or how would you fight the inflationary effects of an additional, 40 to 80 billion dollars of government spending?
Well, again, I dispute your 40 to 80 billion dollars worth of government
I
spending.
guess the net, that's gross. I guess the net, if we take out various cash transfers, would lower that. But we don't. I haven't
Yeah.
done the analysis. I don't know. I don't know how much lower the actual net new spending would be.
Okay. First of all, I don't think it's reasonable to talk about deficit finance basic income. This is redistributive. So we do have to raise taxes, and presumably we have
Okay.
to raise taxes on high income people in order to pay for it. So, in terms of excess demand, you've got two effects that are sort of offsetting one another. Yeah, low income people have more money to spend, high income people have less money to spend. They sort of work in opposite directions. And I don't think that you would find, I mean, if you're not increasing the amount of money in circulation, you're not going to fuel inflation that way. You did mention something else, and that is less investment, crowding out the private sector. If the government raises taxes on high income people, are they going to invest less? Does it mean a lower growth rate? Um, I think that I think that one of the things that happens with the basic income is that labor productivity will increase. I mean, we see it if people invest in education, if people become more productive in the workforce, then growth increases. It doesn't reduce. And I just raising $30 billion by increasing taxes on people with high incomes, I don't see as a negative outcome, and I don't think you'd see a big reduction in the growth rate. I think we do a lot in this country to. Um, I think we do a lot in this country to support high income people in the hope that that money is going to lead to a higher growth rate. I'm not sure we've seen it over the years. So I think this is a shot I'd take.
Okay. I have another question about inflation. It's a little bit more subtle,
Okay.
and that is Canada is not a very competitive country when we're talking about our economy. We are beset by monopolies and oligopolies. Just to give a few examples, we have five grocery chains that control over three-quarters of the market. Cineplex is pretty much our only movie
Yeah.
cinema to a first approximation. The Irving family owns, again to a first approximation, all of New Brunswick. Five banks, 90% of the industry. We have two airlines, again, three-quarters market share. We have two mobile networks. And in fact, although we have a competition bureau, it was just fined $13 million for trying to maintain a level of competition in wireless industry, the mobile phone industry in Canada. And there's so much more: veterinary clinics, dentist offices, real estate companies owning more and more houses, apartment buildings, and condominiums. So my question is, if we get a basic income program, won't these monopolies and oligopolies in Canada realize that there's more money sloshing around, and because there's not really any competition in many of these vital industries like groceries, everyone needs to eat, they'll just raise their prices. So again, inflation does go up for at least the essential goods to mitigate or eliminate any of the extra money that that people are getting as a result of basic income.
Yeah,
And no
that's
one, in fact, is better off.
that is a really, really good question. And no, I don't think that that has to happen. And one of the reasons I don't think that that has to happen is, and you've made the case, we need to do something about the level of competition in this country. It is not inevitable that we should protect all of our industries in order to ensure massive rates of profit. It just isn't. People should be taxed. People should compete. The borders should be open. They should compete with foreign suppliers in all kinds of ways. And we've forced consumers, high income and low income consumers in Canada, to pay higher prices for years and years and years in order to protect the profit rates of these suppliers. And I think that that's a separate question that needs to be answered. And that is, should we not address it on its own terms? And not expect to fight inflation on the backs of people trying to live on $12 or $13 or $14,000 a year.
Well, I love that I'm hearing both a left-wing socialist, we need basic income for everybody rhetoric from you, and also we need a pro-market actual competition and reduce the trade barriers in our society, in our country. I love that these coexist.
Absolutely. We have a tremendous amount of socialism in our country, but it's always, always been focused on high income earners, protecting high income earners from the consequences of the market. It's about time that people at the other end of the income spectrum gain some of the benefits.
Okay. I've got one more big question, and then I want to get into the mechanics a little bit, to some of the specifics, and I think that we'll wrap it up after that. So the big question is, how popular is the basic income? And the reason I'm asking is that we live in what I hope is a democracy.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to undertake a massive program like this, it should be the result of a popular mandate. I don't see any politician's career or party's democratic mandate to govern.
Yes.
I don't see them doing it if they think they won't survive the introduction of basic income. You mentioned earlier $10 a day daycare that the current federal government, in cooperation with the various provinces, is rolling out. But this was, what was it, 15 years ago, the promise of a prime minister running for re-election, and it kind of fell by the wayside. So that's not a new idea. It took 15 years from the time it was a promise to the time it actually started happening. What is the popular view of basic income, and would it be in a government's political interest to introduce such a program nationwide?
I think it's a challenge for a government, no question about it. There's a lot of support for basic income. If you do a simple survey, probably, there have been surveys. Angus Reid did one not very long ago. 70% of Canadians claim to be in support of the basic income. The support goes down rather dramatically when you ask people if they're prepared to pay higher taxes in order to have a basic income.
I'm fine with higher taxes as long as somebody else is paying higher taxes. That's
Well, that unfortunately is everybody's attitude. And there's a belief in this country, this is more of my right-wing pro-market stuff, there's a belief in this country that, there's enough money somehow, that there are rich people out there who can be taxed, who can pay for everything.
People richer than me.
Yeah, richer than me. But that's not true. I mean, upper middle class people are going to be paying more money, and people in professional jobs are going to be paying higher taxes in order to support a basic income. And the question is that going to hurt or help a government? And I think that I don't know what's happening. I mean, I'd love to say that I can see into the future. I know what way things are happening. I know that the kind of society that we've created and the situation we find ourselves in as we come out of COVID, sort of the level of self-involvement and the level of meanness I see across the lack of generosity I see across the population surprises me, and it seems very prevalent. I think that that's something we need to watch going forward. I don't know what's going to happen. I think that people right now, as we come out of COVID, are very, very worried about what's going to happen next. It doesn't surprise me that they say basic income. It's just too big. It's the wrong time to think about something so big. We've got inflation, we've got high interest rates, we've got housing crisis, we've got a million other things that we need to think about. So it doesn't surprise me that people are hesitant. But I think that we have to look not so much about next year or 5 years from now or even 10 years from now. We have to look at the kind of a society that we want to create for ourselves. You keep asking me, you've asked me several times over the past hour, if basic income's so good, how come we don't have it? How come it's not in place? I think we should be asking ourselves now, if we make some decisions now, how's it going to affect the world we have to live in? And more importantly, our children and our grandchildren have to live in, 50 years from now. How will the world be different? And I think a world in which everybody can meet their basic needs, everybody can count on all of society being there to have your back when you run into difficulty is a world that's worth fighting for.
And more compassion and generosity is something that I think we could all benefit from, both on an individual and on a
I think
societal
it's a
level.
really, really hard time. I mean, I don't even know how to react when I turn on the news at night and I see somebody filling up their Ford 150 and talking about the trauma of paying the carbon tax when I've just walked past a tent encampment to get home after work. Or, you see people living by the river and it's getting cold in Winnipeg. Fall is coming. And I'm thinking, I don't think filling your car is the biggest problem we have in society, paying for the gas to drive this truck around so you can park in a suburban lot. And that sounds, these are my people. So, I mean, this is something I think I'm having a really hard time reconciling right now. I see an awful lot of need out there. And I think that we're building more and more walls. So fewer and fewer people are seeing it. We're
All
so
right.
in
So
with trauma.
let's assume that you've convinced our listeners that we need a program like Basic Income. I can refer people to your book, Basic Income for Canadians, Dr. Evelyn Forget. But can you describe? I think it was about page 200 or so, three models of basic income. So can you describe? We've talked at very high levels in general why basic income in principle would be a good thing. What would a basic income program actually look like? How would it be structured, and how would people get their money? Can you summarize what that would look like and how it would be administered?
Yeah, I think that I think I'd like to see a partnership between the provinces and the federal government going into this, because many of the benefits of the basic income will be borne by the provinces and not by the federal government. They'll see it in lower program expenditures for healthcare, for education, and so on. I think that you'd be setting a basic income on the basis of the census family. And the census family is adults, children, and including adult children who live with their parents as part of the family. The size of the benefit would depend on the number of adults in the family. Children under 18 would still receive the child benefit. People over 65 would still be eligible for OAS, GIS. And I would set it at something like 80% of the poverty rate. As you earn income, your benefit declines. but it declines less than proportionately. So for every dollar you earn, the benefit would decline by 50 cents or something like that.
Ah, okay. So that's
All right.
that's good because I know I had some friends that got the CERB benefit
Yep.
entirely legitimately, but
Yes.
they were really worried about even picking up a few hours of
Right.
work
That was your
because if they went over some
yep.
threshold, their CERB benefit disappears, and not just for that month, but like forever. So
Yep.
they were turning down work even though they didn't want to. So
That
what
was
you're saying is that
a terrible design
there's
for the
there's always an incentive. Like you don't earn as much, you don't get as much of the benefit,
but
but
you're always better off if you work.
you're always better off. And then
Yeah.
presumably once you get to, I don't know, maybe twice the poverty line or something, or one and a
Oh,
half times the poverty line,
yeah.
you would get,
It would,
you would get $0 from the basic income program.
it phases out very gradually. So one of the benefits is that it eliminates the welfare wall, for example, because right now most welfare
Okay.
programs, most social assistance
Okay.
programs across the country allow you to earn $200 or something, and then at $200 it disappears entirely. Or
Hmm.
they're all designed a little bit differently. This phases out very very gradually. It would be available whether you work or whether you don't work or whether you work part time. So it would be based on your income. Um, what else?
And then it would just be like OAS or the child benefit. It would just be a direct deposit into a bank account, and if you don't have a bank account, a check mailed to
That's
an
right.
address that the government has on record for you.
That's right. And it could be. I
And
mean, it could be run through the income tax system. It could be run through the provincial social assistance system. There are a number of ways you could administer it. It's not dependent on a particular way of doing it.
and would
Yes,
so
stability over time. So, it doesn't react immediately to changes in your income. So there's a certain stability you can plan into the future.
right. And if I had a job and then I lost it, how long a lag would there be before I was eligible for basic income? Let's say I didn't find a job very quickly after that.
Well, if it replaces income assistance, it has to happen immediately. If income assistance stays in a sort of vestigial form, the two programs can work
Oh, so
together.
I can just say I have this month I'm projecting zero income, so I
You
get that month's
should be able to apply.
supply.
You should be able to apply for it. Yeah,
And then as soon as I get a job, I say, okay, I'm reporting that I have a job. And so it goes down by whatever amount
that's right.
is appropriate. Okay.
That's right.
I guess final question on the mechanics. It costs a lot more for somebody to live in Toronto or Vancouver than Saskatoon or St. John's, for
Yeah,
example. And of course, rural areas are at least housing is a lot less, but other costs like food might be more.
yeah.
Would your vision of basic income take location into account?
I guess people have different positions on this. My own sense is it's about something like OAS and GIS. It does not take location into account. Similarly, the child benefit doesn't take location into account. Now, that's not to say it's not important, but I think the provinces also need to step up to provide additional support. So housing in Toronto is unbelievably expensive. There needs to be a program to address the issues of housing in Toronto over and above a basic income. Similarly with Vancouver. If you think about food prices in the north, there needs to be a program to address the cost of food prices in the north over and above a basic income.
All right. I lied. I have one more question,
Yeah.
and that is something we've touched on. Uh, Regardless of basic income's effect on it, inflation is a fact of life, and when I think of things like minimum wage
Mm-hmm.
or even wages in general, over the course of the last 40 years or so, they have really not kept up
Yep.
with inflation. And so, does your vision of basic income include any kind of protection against if inflation goes up 5% a year over 3 years, you've lost 16, 17% of what
Absolutely.
you can buy?
Absolutely. Any kind of a government social program should be indexed to the rate of inflation. It absolutely should adjust.
Okay. Well, Are there any last thoughts that you have, Dr. Forget?
Nothing that I can think of.
Okay. Well, in that case, if you want more detail, Dr. Forget has written a book about basic income. It's called Basic Income for Canadians. Dr. Evelyn Forget, thank you so much for speaking with me on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you for talking to me today.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web and Facebook and Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.